The ballroom was already alive before the sun had fully set. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, glowing softly like frozen stars. The floor reflected polished shoes and long dresses that whispered as people walked. Soft music played in the background, carefully chosen so it would not distract from conversations about business deals, art collections, and private vacations. This was a place where everything looked perfect, and everyone expected to be seen. Near the edges of the room, a young waitress moved quietly from table to table. She carried a tray with steady hands, her back straight, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid unnecessary attention. She wore the standard black and white uniform, neatly pressed but clearly worn from many washes. To most people in the room, she blended into the background. Like part of the furniture or the walls, she had learned long ago how to be invisible. As she poured drinks and collected empty glasses, she listened without trying to. The guests spoke loudly, confident that everyone wanted to hear them. They talked about profits, awards, new projects, and powerful connections. Laughter burst out often, sharp and proud. No one asked her how her day was. No one wondered where she came from or what her life was like once she left the building. She did not mind, or at least, she told herself she did not. Her shift had started hours earlier, and her feet already ached. Still, she moved with care. A single mistake here could cost her the job. This place did not forgive spills or broken glasses. The managers reminded the staff of that every day. As she passed the center of the room, her eyes briefly lifted toward the grand piano near the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, its black surface shining under the lights. It sat there untouched, more decoration than tool, waiting for someone important enough to play it later in the night. Her chest tightened just a little. She quickly looked away and continued working. There was a time when her hands knew a piano better than they knew trays and glasses. A time when music filled her small room every evening, when her fingers danced across keys without fear. Back then, she believed music would be her future. Not fame, maybe, but a life shaped by sound and feeling. That life felt very far away now. Reality had arrived suddenly, without warning. Family trouble, bills that did not wait, responsibilities that could not be ignored. Lessons stopped, practice faded. The piano at home was sold to pay rent. Music became something she carried quietly inside her, like a secret she was afraid to speak out loud. Here, surrounded by wealth and comfort, that secret felt heavier. A guest raised a hand sharply, snapping fingers in the air. She hurried over, offering a polite smile. The guest barely looked at her while asking for another drink, already turning back to continue a story. She nodded and walked away, the smile fading the moment her back was turned. She did not feel angry. Mostly, she felt tired. As the evening went on, the room grew louder. More guests arrived. The music volume increased slightly. Glasses clinked together in celebration. Somewhere near the stage, a group of guests joked about who might be brave enough to play the piano later. They laughed, assuming it would be someone from their circle, someone with status and confidence. She heard it all while setting down plates. The piano waited. During a short break near the service door, she rested her hands for a moment. She stretched her fingers without thinking, the way she used to before practicing. The motion felt natural, familiar. For a brief second, she imagined the keys under her fingertips. The sound returned in her mind, clear and warm. A voice from the kitchen broke her thoughts. A manager reminding her the break was over. She returned to the floor. As she moved through the crowd again, something inside her felt restless. Not unhappy exactly, but awake. Being so close to the piano made old memories surface more strongly than usual. She wondered who would play it tonight, and whether they would truly feel the music, or just perform it to impress the room. She told herself it did not matter. This was not her world. She stopped beside a table near the front, carefully placing glasses down. One guest glanced at her hands and frowned slightly, as if noticing the faint marks left by years of practice long ago. The look passed quickly, replaced by disinterest. She turned away, unaware that small moments like this were beginning to stack up. The evening continued, smooth on the surface, unchanged. No one noticed the quiet waitress except when they needed something. No one guessed that beneath the uniform was a story still unfinished. And no one yet imagined that before the night ended, the room would hear music unlike anything it expected. For now, she walked on, carrying her tray, carrying her past, carrying a talent she believed the world no longer wanted. But something was waiting, and it was closer than she realized. The night slowly shifted from polite to loud. The earlier calm had disappeared. replaced by raised voices and confident laughter. Guests leaned closer to one another. Glasses refilled again and again. The lights felt warmer now, almost heavy, and the air carried the smell of expensive perfume and strong drinks. The waitress kept working, though her steps felt slower. Her shoulders were tense, and her thoughts drifted more than she wanted. Each time she passed the piano, her eyes were drawn to it again. It still stood untouched, shining under the lights, as if waiting for the right moment. She tried not to think about it. At one table near the center, a group of guests had grown louder than the rest. Their laughter spilled over, catching attention from nearby tables. One of them, clearly enjoying the spotlight, spoke with exaggerated confidence, waving a hand toward the stage. "So this place has a piano," the guest said, loud enough for others to hear, but no one brave enough to play it yet. A few people chuckled. Someone suggested later in the night. Someone else joked that it was too early for embarrassment. The waitress approached the table carefully, setting down fresh drinks. As she leaned forward, one glass tipped slightly. She caught it just in time, but a few drops spilled onto the tablecloth. The laughter stopped. All eyes turned toward her. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice calm but soft. She reached for a cloth, trying to fix the mistake before it became something bigger. One of the guests sighed loudly. "Be careful," they said, not cruel, but sharp enough to sting. Another guest looked at her more closely, then smiled in a way that did not feel kind. "Relax," the guest said. "It's just water. Not everyone here is used to fine things." A few quiet laughs followed. Her face warmed, but she kept her head down. "Of course," she said. "I'll clean it right away." As she wiped the table, the earlier comment about the piano came back into the conversation. "Maybe we should get some entertainment," someone said. "Anyone here play?" They looked around the table, amused. No one volunteered. Another guest glanced at the waitress, then toward the piano. "What about her?" the guest said with a half smile. "She's been staring at it all night." The words were meant as a joke. The table laughed again. Her hands froze for a second. She straightened slowly. "I wasn't staring," she said, keeping her voice respectful. "I was just passing by." "Relax," the guest replied. "We're only teasing." But the attention did not fade. Nearby tables had noticed the exchange. Curious eyes turned toward her, then toward the piano. Someone else added, "Can you play?" The question hung in the air. She felt her heart beat faster. This was the moment she usually avoided. The moment where honesty felt dangerous. "I used to," she said quietly. The response surprised even her. The guests exchanged looks. "Used to," one of them repeated. "So you can play?" She hesitated. Years of doubt pressed down on her. She thought of the long nights without practice, the fingers that now carried trays instead of melodies. She thought of the risk. "I'm not a performer," she said. That wasn't a question. The guest replied lightly. "Can you play or not?" The room seemed to shrink. She became aware of how many people were watching now. Some curious, some amused, some already bored. She swallowed. "I can play a little." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby tables. "Well," the guest said, leaning back, clearly entertained. "Why not? We could use something different." Another voice from the table added, "As long as it's short." The manager noticed the attention and walked over, concern clear on their face. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," one of the guests said smoothly. "We were just wondering if she could play the piano." The manager looked at the waitress, surprised. She nodded slowly. "If it's allowed." The manager hesitated. This was not part of the schedule. But the guests were watching, waiting. After a moment, the manager sighed. "One piece," they said. "Keep it brief." A path seemed to open through the room. Conversations lowered. Phones came out. Some guests leaned forward, expecting something awkward, something to laugh about later. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the piano. Each step felt louder than the last. She was aware of every eye on her back, every whisper behind her. She reached the bench and stopped. For a moment, she considered turning back. Then she sat down. The bench felt colder than she expected. She placed her hands in her lap, breathing slowly. The room was quiet now. Waiting, she lifted her hands and hovered them above the keys. They trembled. She closed her eyes. In that brief silence, the noise of the room faded away. She remembered her small room at home, the soft light, the sound of practice filling the air. She remembered why she loved music in the first place. Her fingers lowered. The first note filled the room. It was gentle, clear, steady. The laughter did not return. People glanced at one another, surprised by the sound. It was not careless or unsure. It carried control. Feeling she continued with each note. Her hands grew more confident. The years between her and the piano began to disappear. The room seemed to breathe with the music. She did not look up, she played. And something began to change. The first notes settled into the room like a quiet breath. At first, people did not react. Some still held their glasses halfway to their lips. Others waited for the mistake they were sure would come. But the sound did not break. It stayed steady, soft, and sure. The waitress sat straight on the bench, her shoulders relaxing with every second. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully at first, as if greeting an old friend after a long time apart. The piano responded to her touch, filling the space with a tone that felt warm and honest. A few conversations tried to continue, but they faded quickly. The music was not loud, yet it reached every corner of the room. It carried something that made people listen without knowing why. Someone near the back lowered their phone. Another guest leaned forward in their chair. The waitress kept her eyes on the keys. She did not look at the audience. If she did, she knew fear might return. Instead, she focused on the feeling beneath her fingers, the smooth surface of the keys, the slight resistance, the familiar pattern her hands remembered better than her mind did. As the melody grew, it began to change. What started gentle became deeper. Notes stretched and rose, then fell again, like a slow wave. There was control in her playing, but also freedom. She was no longer trying to impress. She was telling something. People felt it. A guest who had been smiling earlier now sat still, their expression unreadable. Another crossed their arms, not in judgment, but in focus. Even the staff paused near the walls, trays forgotten for the moment. The manager watched from a distance, unsure of what to do. This was no longer a short performance. But stopping it felt impossible. The waitress breathed with the music. Her hands moved faster now, more confident. The years she had spent away from the piano no longer mattered. The training, the long hours of practice from another life, all returned at once. It felt like coming home. A change in the melody signaled something deeper. The music turned more emotional, carrying a quiet sadness beneath its beauty. It was not dramatic or heavy, but real. The kind of feeling that comes from loss, from letting go, from hoping again after disappointment. Several guests felt their throats tighten. One woman near the front slowly set her glass down, untouched. Another guest wiped their eyes quickly, hoping no one noticed. The waitress did not know this. She only knew the story she was playing. It was her story, though she had never put it into words. The nights she stopped practicing, the day the piano left her home, the moments she told herself that part of her life was over. Her fingers pressed the keys with more strength now. The sound filled the room completely. No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time that night, the guests were not thinking about status or image or control. They were listening. A man who had earlier laughed quietly now stared at the piano, his face serious. He had heard many performances in his life, some by famous musicians, some by trained professionals. But this felt different. It was not polished for applause. It was honest. The waitress reached the center of the piece. The music rose higher, stronger, then softened again. Her hands flew across the keys with ease. The trembling from earlier was gone. In its place was calm. Time seemed to slow. No one noticed how long she had been playing. No one checked a watch. The room existed only inside the sound, near the stage. The grand piano reflected the lights above. But the focus was no longer on how beautiful it looked. It had become a voice. The waitress slightly shifted on the bench, adjusting her posture. She was fully inside the music now. The room around her felt distant, almost unreal. A few guests exchanged looks, not of humor, but of surprise mixed with respect. This was not what they expected when the idea was first mentioned. This was not something to joke about later. The music softened again, slowing down. Each note was placed carefully, as if she was afraid to rush the ending. The melody lingered, allowing the room to breathe with it. Someone near the back let out a quiet sigh without realizing it. The waitress felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from emotion. She poured everything she had held inside for years into the final stretch of the piece. Hope, regret, strength, all of it moved through her hands. The final notes came gently. She let them fade naturally, not rushing the silence that followed. The room stayed quiet. For a moment, no one reacted. It was not because they were unimpressed. It was because they needed time. The waitress lowered her hands slowly and rested them in her lap. Her breathing was steady, but her heart raced. She waited for laughter, for awkward clapping, for someone to speak. None came. Then, A single clap sounded. Another followed. Soon, applause filled the room. Not loud at first, but growing, real, strong. People stood from their chairs without thinking. Some clapped above their heads. Others simply stared at her with expressions they did not try to hide. The waitress finally looked up. She saw faces that no longer looked down on her. She saw surprise, respect, emotion. She stood slowly, unsure what to do next. The applause continued. And in that moment, she realized something important. She had not just played a piano, she had been heard. The applause did not stop quickly. It rolled through the room like a wave, steady and full. Some guests clapped with wide smiles. Others clapped slowly, thoughtfully, as if still processing what they had just felt. A few stood frozen, hands resting on the backs of their chairs, eyes fixed on the piano. The waitress stood beside the bench, unsure where to place her hands. Her fingers still felt warm, as if the keys were there even after she stepped away. She looked out at the crowd, and for the first time that night, she did not feel small. The manager approached her carefully, almost quietly. The stern look that usually lived on their face had softened. "That was unexpected," they said, choosing the words slowly. "You did very well," she nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thank you." The applause slowly faded, but the silence that followed felt different from before. It was not empty, it was full of thought. Guests began to speak again, but their voices were lower now. Conversations had changed. People leaned toward each other, not to boast, but to ask questions. "Did you know she could play like that?" "No, did you?" "I've heard professionals who didn't sound that honest." The waitress stepped away from the piano and returned toward the side of the room, unsure if she should continue working or wait to be told what to do. Her legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from release. The tension she had carried all night had finally broken. A guest near the front turned in their chair to face her. "Excuse me," they said, raising a hand gently, not snapping this time. "How long have you been playing?" She paused. "Most of my life," she answered simply. Another guest joined in. "Where did you study?" She shook her head. "I stopped years ago." That answer seemed to surprise them more than her performance nearby. Someone whispered, "That explains it." She did not ask what they meant. A woman stood and walked toward her, expression calm but emotional. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "That music reminded me of someone I lost." The waitress swallowed. "I'm glad it meant something." "It did," the woman replied, then returned to her seat. One by one, guests began approaching her. Not all at once, not like a crowd, but carefully, respectfully. They spoke to her as if she were suddenly visible in a new way. The manager watched from a distance, clearly unsure how to handle the change in the room. This was supposed to be a controlled event. Nothing unplanned, nothing personal. Yet something deeply personal had taken over. The waitress returned to her duties slowly. She picked up her tray again, feeling different than before. Her posture was the same, but inside, something had shifted. As she moved through the room, people made space for her. Some smiled, some nodded. A few quietly said "well done" as she passed. She did not let it go to her head. She was still working, still responsible for her tasks. But she could not ignore the warmth growing in her chest. Near the stage, a guest who had earlier made jokes about the piano now stood watching her closely. When she approached with a drink, the guest spoke. "I was wrong," they said. "I didn't expect that." She met their eyes briefly. "That's okay," they hesitated. "You shouldn't be carrying trays." She smiled politely. "It's my job." The guest nodded slowly, as if considering something deeper. The rest of the evening unfolded differently than planned. The scheduled speaker was delayed. No one complained. The mood had changed from excitement to reflection. The music she had played still seemed to hang in the air, shaping every conversation. The piano sat silent again, but it no longer felt like decoration. Later, during a quieter moment, the manager approached her once more. "I didn't know," they said. "About your background," she shrugged. "I don't usually talk about it." "Well," the manager replied, "people are asking about you." She felt her stomach tighten. "Is that a problem?" "No," the manager said quickly. "Just unexpected." She nodded. Unexpected seemed to be the word of the night. As the event moved toward its end, a small group of guests gathered near the piano again. They spoke in low voices, glancing in her direction. One of them finally approached. "We're hosting another event next month," the guest said. "Would you consider playing?" The question caught her off guard. She laughed softly, unsure if it was serious. "I'm not a performer. You were tonight," the guest replied calmly. She did not answer right away. The idea felt unreal, heavy, hopeful. "I'd have to think about it," she said honestly. "That's fair," the guest said. "Here." They handed her a card. "If you decide." She accepted it with careful hands. As the room slowly emptied, the staff began cleaning up. Chairs were moved, glasses collected, the lights dimmed slightly. The event that had started like so many others ended quietly, but with a feeling no one expected. The waitress helped clear the final tables. Her body was tired, but her mind was awake. She replayed the performance in her head, every note, every moment of silence. Before leaving, she glanced at the piano one last time. For years, she had believed that part of her life was gone. Now, she was no longer so sure. The night had not given her answers, but it had given her a door. And for the first time in a long while, she felt brave enough to consider opening it. The building felt quieter as the night finally ended. The last guests had gone, their voices fading into the distance. Chairs were stacked, glasses were lined up to be washed. The soft hum of cleaning replaced the music that once filled the room. The waitress finished her final task and set the tray down. Her body was tired in the familiar way, but her thoughts were wide awake. Everything felt slightly unreal, like she had stepped out of someone else's story and was still catching up to her own. She changed out of her uniform in the small staff room. As she folded it carefully, she paused. For years, this uniform had been a symbol of survival. It paid the bills. It kept the lights on. Tonight, it felt different. It was still honest work, but it no longer defined the limits of her life. She stepped outside into the cool air. The city was calm, streets glowing under streetlights. She took a deep breath and started walking toward the bus stop. The card she had been given resting safely in her pocket. She did not pull it out right away. Her mind replayed the night again. Not just the applause, but the silence before it. The way the room listened. The way the music carried her without effort. She realized she had not played to impress anyone. She had played to remember who she was. At the bus stop, she sat down and waited. A couple passed by, laughing softly. Somewhere nearby, a radio played a familiar tune. Music seemed to be everywhere tonight. When she got home, the apartment was quiet. She turned on a small lamp and set her bag down. The walls were plain, the furniture simple. Nothing about the space suggested talent or dreams. Yet this was where she had rebuilt herself piece by piece. She sat at the small table and finally took the card out of her pocket. She turned it over slowly, reading it more than once. An invitation, a possibility. Not a promise, she smiled to herself. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included music again. Not in grand stages or bright lights, but in honest moments. Rooms where people listened. Evenings where sound mattered more than status. The next days passed quietly, but something inside her had changed. She returned to work, and life continued as usual on the surface. But she noticed small differences. She walked with more confidence. She spoke more clearly. She smiled more often, not for customers, but for herself. Word of that night spread slowly, not through headlines or videos, but through people who had been there. A guest mentioned it to a friend. A staff member told a family member. The story grew in small, respectful ways. One afternoon, during a break, she sat outside the building where she worked and stretched her fingers again. The habit returned without effort. She could almost feel the keys beneath them. That evening, she made a decision. She found a small community center a few blocks from her apartment. They offered access to a piano during open hours. It was not grand. Some keys were worn, but it was real. The first time she sat down there, the room was empty. She placed her hands on the keys and paused, just like she had that night. The sound filled the small space, imperfect but alive. She played, not for applause, not for approval, just to play. Weeks later, she received a message connected to the card she had been given. It was polite, simple, an invitation to play again at a small gathering. Nothing formal, no pressure. She accepted. The night of that second performance felt different. She was nervous, but it was a clean kind of fear. The kind that means something matters. She walked in not as a waitress, but as herself. The room was smaller than the first event, the audience quieter, but the listening felt deeper. When she finished playing, the response was warm, genuine. No shock this time, just appreciation. Afterward, someone asked if she taught lessons. She laughed, surprised by the question. Then she thought about it. Maybe, she said, life did not change overnight. She still worked her shifts. She still counted expenses carefully. But music had returned to her days, shaping them gently. She practiced in the evenings, She taught a few beginners. She played at small events when invited. Each step felt earned. One evening, after finishing a lesson, she walked past a cafe with a piano by the window. Someone inside struggled through a simple tune. She smiled and kept walking. She no longer needed to prove anything. The memory of that first performance stayed with her, not as a peak, but as a reminder. A reminder that talent does not disappear just because life becomes difficult. A reminder that being unseen does not mean being unworthy sometimes. She thought about the guests from that night. She wondered if they remembered her, if they still talked about the unexpected music. What mattered more was that she remembered herself. Late one night, back in her apartment, she sat quietly, listening to the city outside. She placed her hands together, feeling the strength in them. She had walked into that ballroom as someone invisible. She had walked out carrying her voice. And she knew now that no matter where life took her next, that voice would never be silent again.